Welcome to Co-Opinions. My name is Josh, and today I have Jake on.
Hello.
So we have quite the hefty topic this evening, but Jake, you've never been on before as far as our listeners know, so why don't you tell us a little bit of the stuff you've been playing recently?
So the things I've been playing recently, I just finished up Ghost Trick, finally, on my iPhone. I've been trying to get my way through that for probably, 2 years, and never got around to quite finishing it. And then before that, I finished up Horizon Zero Dawn, which I am in love with that game. I adore every minute that I have put into that and am ready to play it again.
Now, I've heard nothing but good things about Horizon Zero Dawn, so why don't you what do you enjoy about it so much? Because I'm planning on getting around to it. There's just been a few mitigating factors.
The gameplay, just in general, like the control scheme, is really well done. And on top of that, the story is rather engaging, and the topic of the game, of the plot, is actually really quite good. I don't want to go too much into it because it would just kind of ruin it for you.
Okay, I appreciate that.
It definitely grabbed me, partially because it's semi-scientific.
Interesting.
And deals with things that are topical today, even though when they were writing it, it wasn't intended to be that way.
Now, at first you had me curious, now you have me intrigued. So, I'll probably be picking up sooner rather than later. I haven't done a whole lot on my side game-wise because, again, still studying for that silly certification, but it should be done before too long. I got the Platinum in Resident Evil 7 like I said I would in the last podcast. I have been playing A Boy and His Blob with Kara, which is a Wii game. It was originally a Nintendo game. They remade it for the Wii, and they ported it to PS4 and Xbox One. Controls aren't great, but it's still fun. But let's go ahead and launch into our big topic, because somewhat recently, last month, Zelda Breath of the Wild came out, and this prompted me to thinking, I've played almost every Zelda game, and I know people who have played almost every Zelda game. Who do I know that has played almost every 2D Zelda game, and I haven't had on yet? Jake! So,
the guy who you actually cut from an episode.
You can't hold on to that forever, okay? So we got talking about it, and we thought, yeah, let's go ahead and we're going to hit these 2D Zelda episodes. We'll try and fit as many as we can into one. There's 13 of these things. We cannot do this. Well, maybe we can split it up into 2. We still can't do that. And prior to us jumping on, we were planning on splitting it up into 3, and that still doesn't work. So now, instead of 3 hour-long episodes, we're going to have 4 slightly shorter episodes, so that way it makes more coherent sense.
And we've been talking about this for probably the better part of a month.
Oh yeah, we've been
in terms of planning it, and then the decision to do multiple groupings has probably been 2 weeks worth of talking. Granted, we crammed all of that into 48 hours, but
still a lot of talking. There's no denying that. But let's start at the very beginning. There's really nowhere to start except the very beginning.
The thing that started it all.
Absolutely. And that would be The Legend of Zelda on the original Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, this game came out in Japan in 1985?
Right, and it came out for the Famicom Disk System, which is not the Famicom Entertainment System. So we got the Nintendo Entertainment System, which over there was the Famicom Entertainment System. Theirs was more of a computer. The Disk System was more of an actual family computer, which is what Famicom actually stands for.
Mm-hmm.
So when they released it on that, it was mildly different than what we know as The Legend of Zelda. There were a couple of things in it that didn't port over to the console because it was never intended to be on the console originally.
Now, what were some of the things that didn't make it over, out of curiosity? Now, this is really interesting trivia for me.
So one of the things that didn't come over is the disk system had a microphone in the controller. And the microphone, you could actually blow into it as an attack. And there were certain enemies that was the only way you could defeat them.
That was the Pole's voice, I believe. They look like bunnies.
Yes.
And there was a tactic, there was a hint in one of the dungeons where the wise man would say, Poles hate loud noises.
Right. In fact, it was also in the instruction booklet. They make a mention of that in the booklet that came with the games, because, booklets with video games was a thing back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually shows the enemy and says, does not like loud noises. And, of course, everybody's like, okay, that's great. What does that mean to anything?
But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves on this. We're just focusing on the differences. Now, in an era of games where it was mostly platformers or generic sports games, Zelda was a dramatically different approach to gaming. Zelda had dropped you in the middle of a world, and the only indication you had of what to do was the fact there was a black box on the screen you started on. You really weren't given any kind of indication what you were supposed to do.
Right.
Now, this was also from an era where the instruction booklet was crucial. And we're going to touch on how crucial it was when we get to Zelda II, because you linked me some stuff that blew my mind about that game. Anyways, so when you go into this first area, this first cave, the old man says it's dangerous to go alone, take this. That has become crucial, ingrained into gaming lore at this point.
It's meme central
right
at this point.
Absolutely. I mean, so many games have referenced it that it's taken on a life of its own. But from there, you are given the sword. You aren't told where to go. You aren't really told what to do. And this incredibly open approach, I played this game as a young child. I don't know how old you were because you're like 40 years older than me.
Oh, come on.
And I was absolutely floored by how expansive this game was. To give you the scope of the game, they included a little mini-map in the upper left corner, but it was just a gray field. So you had an idea of where you approximately were, but you didn't specifically know. Now, there were some magazines like Nintendo Power that would include a map. And the map, even looking at it now, it's amazing to look at how they designed this map.
Right.
If you go in and see how they split everything up, the way that they took the approach to giving you the items, which in that game were not necessary a lot of them weren't necessary to continue on, not nearly as much as Zelda's nowadays. So, Jake, why don't you take over, and how was your initial impressions of this game?
My initial impressions were, because I played it when I was really young.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I mean, it was one of the earlier games to come out for the Nintendo as Nintendo was popular.
Right.
Because we're skipping over the years of the whole Rob thing.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, when it became big, it was one of the first games that really, really started pulling people in. And it was just, as a kid, I was blown away with, I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. It's just this big open, oh, look, I found a hole in a tree that I can go into. I'll go in there and, oh, look, it's a dungeon.
Now, it was interesting that first dungeon, you could tell there was a very deliberate design they went for in that, because it's very close to your starting point. And I'm not going to say they funnel you toward it, but if you go in almost any other direction, there is stuff that is very different. So on the way to the first dungeon, you really only fight one enemy type. You only really fight Octoroks. Now, there are some Zoras because you pass water, but the game kind of directs you that way without explicitly pointing you in that direction, which I thought was amazing.
Right. It's really good game design, especially for its time.
It really made you focus on what you were trying to figure out what was happening. You were trying to figure out, okay, now that I'm in here, I obviously need to kill things. That is the only thing they have explicitly told me that I should do, because it's dangerous to go alone. Take this.
Right.
And the very first dungeon, do you happen to remember off the top of your head what the item they gave you in that dungeon was? The reason why it's hard for me to remember is because, again, the items weren't absolutely crucial. I know it wasn't the boomerang, because the boomerang was an item that you got in the second dungeon, I believe, not even as a treasure. And the items were things like you got a raft or you got a ladder, and they were used much later. And that became really interesting when you got to about the fifth or sixth dungeon. You had to use these things. That was kind of their way of saying you had to have gone to the earlier dungeons. but you didn't have to necessarily beat them in the order that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Right. It was relatively open world, which, I mean, you can make a very good case that this is the father of open world games.
And from there, it even got more open in that once you beat the first game, or if you entered Zelda as your name, I don't think you had the option between uppercase and lowercase. I frankly don't remember.
Back then, I think the limitations of the system were you had one or the other, but you couldn't have both.
So when you beat the game or you entered Zelda, a white sword was put next to your character and you started the second quest. Now, what was notable about the second quest to me was, actually, you have this all written down. I don't want to mow your lawn.
So the Zelda naming character gave you the second quest, which was kind of a different order for everything. Different dungeons were in different locations in the game, and the enemies were substantially harder. There was also another option that you could put your name as Link instead of Zelda.
I was actually not aware of that.
And if I remember correctly, if you put in Link, it gives you kind of a leg up. It gives you a couple more extra hearts.
I'll have to check that out because, fun trivia, the reason he was originally called Link was because the idea was he was going to be a link between the person playing and the character. He was supposed to just be a persona of the person who you were playing as. So,
which is why he's always Link in all of the other games.
Exactly. Later, he took on additional characteristics, but they tried to make him intentionally bland for the first game. Now, the success of this game is unparalleled, and there were a ton of imitators that followed after this.
Well, first off, you're forgetting one of the best parts about the game.
Mm-hmm.
Gold cartridge.
The gold cartridge. Now, tell me when you were growing up that you didn't have about 1,000 people who said, oh, it's rare because it's gold.
Right, and I think that was kind of part of the point to show, or to create this sense of rarity, even though it's probably one of the most sold games for Nintendo, for the NES of all time.
Now, an interesting thing that I was not aware, well, I was fully aware of this, but I didn't put it together. Since it was originally on the Famicom Disk System, was there a built-in hard drive on that? Did that allow them to save? Because what was interesting was in America, it was the first game with a lithium-ion battery built in to allow you to save without the use of passwords. This was a really big deal.
Yeah, that was huge.
Now, did they not have that in Japan?
No, if I remember correctly, because the Famicom Disk System, when you hear disk system, you kind of go back and think about the old like Nintendo 64 disk system. But really, it's more like floppy disks.
Mm-hmm.
So theoretically, it was probably more along the lines of saving to floppies rather than saving to... Don't give me that funny look.
Well, I'm not giving you the funny look because of the floppies. It just never even occurred to me that the Famicom Disk System used floppy disks.
Right. It may have used... I don't know because I haven't done the full deep dive on really what the Famicom Disk System was like. It may have been cassette tapes. That was common in early computers where you saved things and you read programs from cassette discs instead of... But if they're calling it a disk system, I would expect it's more of a floppy disk.
Okay. Now, an interesting point, and I had this discussion many moons ago when I still worked a retail job. This game was, and you noted this, was an inspiration for RPG games, but this itself is not really an RPG.
Yeah, this is considered an adventure game.
Right. Even though prior to this, an adventure game was more like your King's Quest, Quest for Glory, text-based move around, right. Investigate rock, climb wall.
Or platformers like Castlevania.
Right. So this broke a lot of ground, which isn't to say there weren't other games who did similar things. I'm sure there were, even though I myself cannot think of any. It inspired a ton of, I don't want to say rip-offs because they tried to put their own spin on it. The success of that, debatable, but they tried. And once you got to the end of this game, so the first 5, 6 dungeons, for the first 4, you could just find them out in the wild. After that, you had to start having items to get to them. I remember the 7th and 8th and 9th dungeons explicitly were hidden. And
one of them was, in fact, like, invisible, wasn't it?
The one that, I'm not sure if it was invisible.
Like, it was a spot in a wall, and you couldn't You literally couldn't get it unless you just found it.
And that's one of the things that was super amazing about this game, was how much it encouraged exploration. I remember as a child running around in the northwest corner, and I was just pushing random statues out of the way, and I pushed this statue out of the way, and a power bracelet? Why is there a power bracelet here? And I will still remember to this day that power bracelet's there, even though in the first game it did one thing, and that one thing was almost useless. Anyways, I still recall it. And that kind of exploration, burning down a random bush, the secret is in Spectacle Rock, because was that the 8th or 9th dungeon that was in Spectacle Rock?
I honestly don't remember, because it's been a very long time since I played the original Zelda.
But as you got further and further, at the very end, you got to the 9th dungeon. And at the end of this massive 9th dungeon, if you had all the pieces of the Triforce, then you could fight Ganon. And Ganon, I mean, he wasn't super impressive in that game. There's no two ways around it. But then you went and you found Zelda, you saved her, that was the game.
I mean, one of the design setups that was really made that kind of interesting, the dungeon specifically, was in later games, the screen scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
But in this one, it loads a new room. So every screen is a room. And each dungeon is just a bunch of interconnected rooms.
Mm-hmm.
And the later on dungeons just get bigger and bigger and more sprawling.
Mm-hmm.
And it's obviously a design choice, because they couldn't keep 500 rooms in memory.
Right.
So they were writing each one as they went, which is kind of impressive for the size of their cartridges that they had at the time.
And speaking of design decisions, is there anything else you'd like to mention about this first game? It was super influential. There have been so many countless games that have emulated it since then. I loved it as a child. I'll go back and play it occasionally. What doesn't age well is when you know where things are, it's not really that long of a game.
Yeah, because this was built during the era when replayability was definitely a factor. You had to be able to play it, replay it, kind of again and again, or get a lot of time out of it, because you spent a lot of money on these cartridges. And this game was very much about the exploration. So it didn't handhold you through anything. You had to explore. You had to play around with it.
It was definitely a departure, but it was a departure that paid off tremendously.
Yes,
because this is one of the most well-known franchises.
And what's funny about that is, so it did very well in Japan, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But Nintendo did not expect it to go well in the US. So much so that it was released 18 months after the original release in Japan, and 6 months after Zelda II came out in Japan.
Now, if I've ever heard a good segue to the next game, that might have been it. Is there anything else you want to address about the first Zelda?
I don't think so.
Fantastic. So, speaking of design decisions, Zelda 2 came out on the Nintendo as well, and I will be 100% honest here. I did not play Zelda 2, I did not beat Zelda 2, because when I booted it up as a child, I went, this is nothing like the first Zelda. And I tried to run around for a minute and I just wasn't feeling it. I have watched a complete Let's Play of it, so I know everything that happens in the game, but I myself have not done it. Now, Jake, once upon a time, you did do it, didn't you?
I did not beat it. I did play it.
Now, why did you not beat it?
I remember it being quite a bit harder than the original one, partially because the fights in that were more platform-based.
And that's an important distinction. So in the first game, everything was done from a top-down perspective. Everything. You fought from a top-down perspective, you explored from a top-down perspective, and you achieved from a top-down perspective. In the second game, the only thing you did from a top-down perspective was move on the world map. Now, this already was a huge departure because this game was actually an RPG. Because you leveled up.
Yeah.
And you chose what stats went up.
It had a full experience system, which was probably one of the reasons why it was so difficult for young me. Because, one, it was nothing like the fight sequences were nothing like original Zelda.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was so platformy, which I believe was kind of an intention to emulate the success of Castlevania,
Right.
which had done huge gangbusters at the time.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, I was never any good at Castlevania, and I think the same thing pretty much led into this. And then there was, even the villages were side-scrolling.
Right. And so how do you happen to remember how far you got? It was long enough ago, I don't blame you for not remembering.
I don't remember exactly how far I got, but I do remember one of the first instances I found out about Zelda 2 was at a friend of my dad's house. He had bought it, and he was grown. I was just a little kid.
Right.
And he let me play it, but he was like, please don't save anything. I am just a couple hours away from beating the game with, rescuing Zelda. And I can't afford to lose the lives, because you did have lives in this.
You did have lives. Now, when you lost all your lives, it didn't completely screw you. It just sent you back to where Zelda was. Now, this is crucial. You start the game at a shrine where Zelda is sleeping.
Right, so first off, we need to say that this is a direct sequel from The Legend of Zelda, which doesn't sound like a big thing, but in the Zelda world and later games, that gets really convoluted. So
right.
It's important to show that this is a direct sequel from the very first game,
and
so it follows the original.
You have to read verbatim what that story is, because I really just thought that you were going to wake up Zelda. It is so much more than that. I had no idea how much went into this.
Yes, and the game isn't real explicit that I remember.
No, it's
telling you this.
It never tells you this. That's why this blew my mind.
Right. So, and it's really great because it explains a lot of things about the whole franchise. So in this particular game, the Zelda that you wake up, or you come across is not the Zelda from the first game. It's actually a princess of Hyrule from a very long time ago, in which The Legend of Zelda originated. Her brother tried to force her to tell him about the secrets that their deceased father had held about the 3 golden triangle treasures of the Triforce. The brother's wizard friend got angry in basically her denying this and tried to attack her with his magic. The magic actually backfired and killed the wizard, but unfortunately it also just forced her into a deep sleep. So the brother, in feeling terrible remorse over the actions between, him trying to force his sister to give him information and the attack from the wizard, since he was unable to reverse the spell, he put her in a special tower and decreed that all princesses born in the family would be named Zelda in remembrance of this tragedy.
Which, this gets a little more complicated when you realize this game, if we're looking at the official timelines that they put out, this is the very last game in the Fallen Hero timeline. So it sort of explains part of this.
Well, yes, but notice that they don't specifically state which Zelda that is sleeping. They say that it's one from long ago.
There's no way this is Skyward Sword Zelda. Like, we're getting way ahead of ourselves on this one, but there's no way it is that old. But anyways, I had no idea about any of that. So I know one of the most notable things is at the end of this game, you fight Shadow Link. And there's a reason for that, isn't there? Because when you get to the very final dungeon, so you go around this whole world, and this game, unfortunately, was kind of like adventure games at their worst, because they were so obtuse about so many random things. Like, you had to go to a random patch of forest to find a key item you could not continue to progress in the game without.
Right, well, and a lot of design decisions didn't necessarily make sense. I mean, it's like Castlevania. Hey, look, I broke down this wall and I found a turkey.
Yeah, but at least with Wall Chicken, you're just destroying stuff, and you might accidentally destroy the wall. There's a little patch of forest nowhere near here. Like, you'll be on an Eastern Peninsula, and the only clue you'll get, Eastern Peninsula has the secret. What you have to do is stand in front of a patch of forest, play a flute, and then it'll show a hidden village. Why would you possibly think that? Now, let it be noted, in the last game we were complimenting and talking up how the sense of exploration was amazing and the experimentation was incredibly intriguing. But this wasn't really experimentation so much as go to every tile and try everything. Like, this was trial and error. Like, this wasn't the same.
Right. Well, and again, this was another game that was built for the Famicom Disk System, not the entertainment system. So there were actually differences between the original release and the US release. There were some substantial differences, so it's quite possible that some text that was going to give you a better hint was left out.
Possibly. So you're thinking there is the possibility that there were some translation issues.
Right.
Now,
I mean, back then, translation teams was usually a guy in a closet.
Yeah. I can't argue with that because I know there's actually a lot of stories about how things got translated very awkwardly. But this game also introduced some other attempts at innovation. Actually, come to think of it, they carried on. This game introduced the magic meter.
Right, which is in, I want to say, all of the games that followed after it, if not
all,
most.
but a lot. And some variation of it. So, for example, getting ahead of ourselves again, Link Between Worlds, it kind of has a magic meter, but the magic meter refills automatically. This game's magic meter was brutal. You didn't really have a way to refill it except for little bottles you randomly found. Right. And so that was kind of savage. And this game gets a lot of disdain, but I almost feel like it's unfair.
Well, and so one of the things that Nintendo's always been good about is really playing off of the innovation. They've always been a very innovative company. I mean, looking at their consoles alone can show you how much they've tried to innovate over the years. And this was just them, I want to say continuing, but really it was them starting with that feeling of constantly innovating.
The innovation, I mean,
you're going to not always hit 100%.
You're not going to hit 100%. But in watching the Let's Play, it's really impressive to me how many things they actually kept on from that game for their games. For example, the villages you go to the village of Saria, you go to the village of Darunia, you go to the village of Nibiru. Zelda fans will recognize all of those names as sages from Ocarina of Time. The magic meter got carried over. You pointed out that this was one of the first times that the Triforce was really recognized as a symbol of power, like the three separate entities.
Right. Well, so in the first game, it was just the Triforce, and it was this triangle thing that you were putting together out of pieces. Mm-hmm. And it was just one triangle. And in Zelda 2, it's the first time they mention that there's really more than one, or particularly three.
See, I'd always gotten that a little confused, because in the first one, I thought you put together the 8 pieces, then Ganon also had one, and then Zelda had a third one. That's how I interpreted it.
So back then, of course, during the Nintendo Power eras, there were often comics that would follow these releases. So I remember them talking about that in the comic, but I don't remember it in the game. What I do remember thinking was, when you beat the game, you get the first Triforce. Mm-hmm. And then when you put your name in as Zelda and hit the harder one, that's a second piece of the Triforce.
That is not how I recall it, but my memory is not good enough to dispute it. So,
well, and I'm also kind of remembering from the haze of long ago when the dinosaurs were around.
You beat me to it. You can't be that self-deprecating. It ruins the fun. So, getting back onto Zelda 2 for a moment, it tried a lot of really interesting things. Some of them got carried forward, and I can't, again, speak to it extensively because I watched somebody else beat it, somebody who plays games more or less for a living. Not that they're very good at it, this particular individual, but I watched him play through the whole thing. It was entertaining and it was educational. It's also curious to see what characters, because I feel like they picked a few characters from that game and brought it forward. For example, there was a dragon in that game that looked amazingly rendered for being a Nintendo game. And it seemed like that was the inspiration for the dragon from Ocarina of Time, which that'd be very curious to me. But this is about all I have to add on the second game, because this is not one that I have a ton of experience with.
And there's actually something I wanted to hit on the original game that we kind of skipped over real quick. The original game, during its development, was intended to actually have a time travel and technological aspect to it, to the point where one of the pieces of the Triforce actually was a circuitry for Triforce. Obviously, those did not end up carrying over because it was hard to complete with the limitations of the system that they had. But that was where they originally kind of wanted to go with it, was that, you know, you had your fantasy side, and then you would move to a different era and be in a technological side instead, which I think is very
ambitious.
It is. And I think it's very interesting to think about, knowing where it eventually led to in Zelda and what Zelda has become, to think, man, this could have been completely different.
Oh, yeah. World of different. I can't... And you see, every once in a while, you see concept art of a futuristic Zelda, and we're getting completely off topic here, and I'll bring it back in, but Breath of the Wild has shown us that there's a lot of legs left on this franchise, even the general area they're at. Like, I want to play that game so bad, Jack. I want to play it so bad.
Who doesn't want to play that game?
So bad. Haters.
Yeah, haters. Just about.
And they're going to hate.
But that's fine, because it just means more for us.
Yeah, just gotta... Anyways, anything else on Zelda 2?
This is the first game where we get to see the full Triforce reunited.
That is correct. And I know why they didn't give story, because technical limitations and such, but I really felt like it was just kind of a fever dream at the beginning and end, because there's a sleeping chick on a pedestal, and then at the end of the game, you fight a creepy floating thing. That's Thunderbird. You may see that somewhere in the synopsis, because you fight a lot of really weird-looking enemies. The second to last boss looks like an enemy from a Ninja Gaiden game. It's so bizarre. And then you fight Dark Link. Like, what?
Right, which is you, except just a black silhouette.
Right. And then when you beat Dark Link...
Is he Dark Link, or is he Shadow Link? Because there's a differentiation where one is just a kind of a negative of you, whereas the other one is a created by kind of a Ganon-style force. There is actually a differentiation in this.
See, there might be, but this is starting to sound like the difference between Metal Sonic and Silver Sonic, where it's like, this one first came in Sonic 2. Or the difference between Bowser Jr. and Baby Bowser. There is technically a difference. I don't know it, though, and I'm not going to pretend to know it. A final note on this second Zelda game was, we haven't talked much about Ganon in it, and it's because the only real presence he has is all the enemies are trying to kill you to use your blood to revive Ganon.
Right, and if you're on the main screen, the map screen, one of the ways you know that you might be in a random encounter is there are enemies that wander around, and the larger enemy, the stronger one, looks kind of like a silhouette of Ganon.
There you go. But anything else for Zelda 2 for you?
There is one more thing, and so in Zelda 2, at the beginning, there's a character called Impa that mentions that you have a mark on your hand, and that mark shows that you're the chosen one. And I specifically remember that showing up in the comics a lot.
Now, the mark that it mentions when I read the synopsis was a Hylian crest, which that's more like the wings coming out on the side thing. Yeah, it's
unfortunately
on the flag.
The door is not open, so...
Yeah, I guess we could have shown that.
You need to mount it right here.
Possibly. This room still needs to be finished. But...
Well, also, we're specifically talking about that particular franchise, so it would be really good since you're doing live streaming.
Very valid. Anyways, that mentioned that he was going to be a future king of Hyrule if he had the crest on the back of his hand.
Right.
And it wasn't just the Triforce. That's what jumped out at me, because in later iterations, he had a Triforce, but the Triforce of Courage was always the one colored in.
Right, that's the one he always gets, because he is the embodiment of courage.
Right. moving on to the next game.
Yes.
In what we've been focusing on now is the two Nintendo games. We originally thought about doing these episodes in terms of where they fell on the timeline. We thought about where they fell in relation to when they came out. So we decided to take a bit of a mixed approach. Now, these first two games we talked about officially fall at the end of the decline era, where if the hero dies during the Ocarina of Time, he fails to defeat Ganon in Ocarina of Time. Then it shoots off and becomes Link to the Past, then Link's Awakening, Oracle of Seasons, Oracle of Ages, Link Between Worlds, Zelda 1, Zelda 2. I believe that is how it goes.
I think Link's Awakening comes after Zelda 2. I believe that's the same Link. I
After,
could be wrong.
I will almost take you to bat for that. But what we are going to focus on now is Link to the Past, because that still kind of falls in the timeline. It'll eat up the rest of the evening, and it will give us somewhere to launch off of for the next episode. Also, thank you very much for your super insightful comment, Brent. Really appreciate that. So, Link to the Past, this is the de facto game that people love to death. I do. Okay, let me take that back a step. I love it to death. Everybody else can go die.
Hey, you know what? I'm right there with you. As far as I am concerned, this is the greatest Zelda game ever made. I know that there are a lot of people who say that Ocarina of Time is the winner.
And Breath of the Wild's a real strong contender nowadays.
And it has a huge list of awards to it, but there is just so much in Link to the Past that was introduced that has shown up in almost every other Zelda game. I mean, the music that we think of as Zelda music debuted in Link to the Past.
Well, for the most part.
The really good orchestral stuff. Okay. I mean...
Orchestral on the Super Nintendo?
As compared to the original Nintendo?
All right, valid. I'll grant you that.
Come on, it actually had a wavetable.
Okay.
Instead of beep, boop, beep, boop.
Now, almost from the get-go, Link to the Past had a more cinematic feel to it, because you wake up on this dark, stormy night, and your uncle tells you, don't go outside. I'll be back later. And of course you're going to go outside. They told you not to do a thing.
Right, and you're obviously a teenager in this, so...
Absolutely. And you follow him out, and they straight up railroad you at this part. There's no doubt about it. You can only go to follow your uncle.
It's an introduction to the game, which makes it passable.
But it's a snappy introduction.
Yes.
Because within 5 to 10 minutes, you are in the first dungeon of the game, and you get an item, you are introduced to combat, your uncle dies, you have to save Zelda. She is your... Which is actually a mistranslation. Going back to your earlier point, it's supposed to be she's your destiny or something. It's not supposed to be ambiguous as to whether or not you might be related to her. Because that's really what it seems like.
We've got a Star Wars thing going on here.
Exactly. So, the first dungeon, you go through and you rescue Zelda, you fight a bunch of enemies, and you escape to the sanctuary.
Right.
And we're not going to step through all the beats of the game. We're just going to talk about from there. They give you directions, but a lot of the map is open to you at that point.
Right.
Because you can go from that point, you can go almost anywhere on the main map that doesn't require the power glove. And I think in the light world, that might be it.
Trying to think. There are a couple of places you can't get to without the flippers as well.
Oh, right, the flippers. But the flippers, you have to get those I guess it's the second Dark World dungeon. I was trying to think of the specifics to make sure.
And you can't get into the Lost Forest without, I think, some of all of the pendants, because you'll just get lost.
Well, kind of.
Well, it kicks you out, I think.
You can't pick up the sword.
Well, there's that too.
But anyways, we're getting ahead of ourselves there. So you go, and your goal is to find these 3 pendants. They basically say you have to get the 3 pendants so that way you can defeat the current evil. And when you get the 3 pendants, you don't really have a lot of freedom at this point, because you have the 3 places you have to go. Right. Now, I've never actually tested this, but can you beat the 3rd pendant dungeon before the 2nd one?
I don't think you can. And in fact, I believe you're required to go to the desert world, or the desert palace first, because that's when you meet Sahasrara.
Well, the Eastern Palace is where you meet and
Eastern Palace. The Desert Palace is...
And you have to beat that first, because that's how you get the Pegasus boots, and you can't get into the Desert Palace without the Pegasus boots, because you need the Pegasus boots to knock down the Book of Medora.
Right.
And the Book of Medora, this is one of those interesting things where it's not a single-use item. It's a 4-time use item, right, but it's not a single use.
But many times you don't know, like, one of the items that you can get with the Book of Medora isn't necessary at all.
Well, 3 of the items. So oh wait, you're right. It's only no. Yeah, it's only
the Cloak of Invisibility is absolutely not essential to anything.
What do you need the Book of Medora for to get the Cloak of Invisibility?
Don't you?
No. You need the Book of Medora to get the 3 medallions. You need 2 of those medallions to get into later dungeons, but the Bombos medallion is never used for anything. The Cloak of Invisibility you get by running into a headstone in the graveyard. We'll get to it, though.
That's right.
Anyways, what really was impressive to me as a child was after you got the 3 pendants, you went to fight the evil because Zelda got kidnapped. Oh no, we gotta go.
You mean Aghanim?
Yes. Did that need to be I guess that didn't, because I've never said Aghanim before this point, have I?
No.
The reason you're going to even rescue Zelda is because Aghanim has kidnapped her, taken over Hyrule Castle, the king has disappeared, and it's a really big deal, so you're going to save her. She's been hiding in the sanctuary while you're getting the pendants. When you get the 3rd pendant, you go to get the Master Sword, because only the Master Sword can defeat evil, the Sword of Evil's Bane specifically. Now, this is the first game, I believe, where they explicitly introduced the Master Sword.
Yes.
Which is super important because after this game, the Master Sword is in almost every game. It is a huge deal, especially in the 3D Zelda games.
Right.
Huge deal.
To the point where, for the longest time, people wanted an actual reproduction of the Master Sword to, like, hang on their wall, and nobody made one.
Right. Because Nintendo is real chintzy with the official merchandise. So you get the Master Sword, and Zelda gets abducted. So quick, go run to save Zelda from Aghanim. This was something that really kind of blew my mind as a child.
Well, so the reason why Aghanim was going after Zelda...
Do you know it at this point? When did they tell you that? Did Sarasrilla tell you that?
I believe it was Sahasrara that told you that.
Okay.
But it was, and it may have been Zelda that told you this. I don't remember, because I'm probably mixing up the official game story with the comics, which I was a huge fan of, because they came in every Nintendo Power, and I actually had every single one of those Nintendo Powers with that storyline in it. Mm-hmm. But it's specifically because Zelda and 7 other girls were descendants of the original sages that locked away Ganon.
Oh, right. Because the backstory to this game, which is told, there are a few NPCs who tell you, but they tell it in the pre-scroll to the game. Ganon wanted the Triforce. He invaded the Golden Land, grabbed the Triforce. It gave a reflection of his heart, which turned the light world in the Golden Land into the dark world, and they sealed him inside. Well, he got sealed inside by the 7 wise men a long time ago.
Right. Mm-hmm. And which is why everyone who gets transported to the Dark World ends up changing into some form of
a reflection
of their own hearts as well.
Right. So the reason that Aghanim has been abducting people, because you find out that Aghanim has abducted 6 other females. Zelda is the 7th. When he sends all 7 of them into the Dark World, it'll break the bond between the Light World and Dark World, and Ganon can come back. So you go to save Zelda, and you fail. And you fight Aghanim, get kicked over to the Dark World. Suddenly, oh my god, there's a whole second world.
So Aghanim, if I remember correctly, was a projection of Ganon.
You are getting all the way ahead. You are correct. At the very end of the game, once you get all 7 crystals and go into Ganon's lair, at the very top you fight Ganon again. You go into Ganon's lair and you fight Aghanim again. And when
that's right.
Right. And then when you defeat Aghanim, thump, and then Ganon rises out of him. So what you thought was a puppet of Ganon appears to just be Ganon.
Right, because you do defeat Aghanim in the light world.
Right.
The first time, but he, as a last-ditch effort, he transports you into the dark world with him.
Mm-hmm. And at that point, if you hadn't gotten the item from one of the earlier dungeons that prevented you from transforming, I'm guessing you get turned into a bunny there. I've never actually went to the dark world without getting the Moon Pearl first.
You're not supposed to be able to get the Moon Pearl until later.
You get the Moon Pearl in the third dungeon in the light world.
Is that... Oh, that's right, because you temporarily get transported there, you run across through an area, and then you transport back.
Correct. You run across Spectacle Rock on Death Mountain so you can get to the whatever they call that. Hedora's Tower, I think. Maybe.
Yeah.
Anyways, so this game, once you get dropped in the dark world, through the whole game, there's a huge sense of exploration. There is little side stuff you can do everywhere. You can collect bottles. Did you know that I just learned this when some people did a Let's Play of it. You know how you can drain the aqueduct at that one part to get a heart piece?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you have to do it for a certain dungeon, but a fish will start flopping around.
Yeah.
So you knew that you could grab it and throw it back into deeper water, and it'll say, thanks for bringing me back.
Yeah.
Did you know you can take it all the way to the merchant in Kakariko Village, and then if you give it to him, he'll give you stuff?
No.
How crazy is that?
That's impressive.
Second thing, I'm learning stuff about this 2 decades later. The bubbles in the Dark World dungeons, those aren't bubbles. Those are anti-fairies. If you sprinkle those little pink things with the skull inside with magic powder, it'll turn them into fairies.
I think I knew that. I don't think I knew that they were like anti-fairies, and that's why I did that. I think I just knew that you sprinkle them and poof, they're...
Blew my mind. Just blew it. I had no idea.
This game was, for its time, was massive.
It was super. In fact, it's still pulling up the map. Like, it's a classic map.
Right. Well, so at the time, the regular size cartridge was 4 megabits, which is effectively like 512K. The Zelda cartridge was the first cartridge to have double that amount. It was an 8 megabit cartridge, which means a full megabyte of memory to write a game in. It doubled the allowance of the color palette. It gave, double the amount of room for a map, for sprites, for any number of things. And they used so much of that.
And it was incredibly impressive. There's no way around it. We talked about in the very first game, and I think you could do this in the second game too. It would make sense. The non-linearity of it.
Mm-hmm.
So in the light world, you kind of had to hit those first 3 dungeons in a row. In the dark world, once you got the hammer, that made it so that way you could get to a lot of the extra world because they kind of blocked you off.
Right. So in the light world, they mostly used big rocks.
Right.
And then occasionally there were wooden posts that usually didn't block you too much, but there were a couple that kept you from getting like special, heart pieces.
Right. And it was really, really impressive the way that they just gave these little obstacles that kind of slowed you down, but they incentivized you to really explore. I know that nowadays when I play the game, I'll beat the first dungeon, second dungeon, fourth dungeon, third, sixth, then I'll get the light arrows. Because you don't have to go in a particular order. Much like the first game, they occasionally give you items that are required to... I'm trying to think. I don't think any of the bosses you have to use the item you get in the dungeon to beat. Now, I could be wrong. I don't remember for the squid boss, which is the second Dark World dungeon, if you have to use the hook shot to beat him. I can't remember that.
I remember you had to do that for the eyeball. Yeah, you had like 8 eyeballs or 7 eyeballs or something that swirled around him.
Are you thinking of the one in the slime dungeon?
Might be.
Maybe
he was just the big eyeball and then...
Well, there were more than one eyeball.
But you hook shotted them, you pulled the little things that were around them.
That was the squid.
Okay, that was the squid.
Yeah. Okay, so that one I thought you had to use the hook shot with, but in most of them, there are alternate ways to approach basically anything. So for the first boss in the Dark World, you could use bombs instead of the hammer. In fact, the hammer was a nightmare to use for that boss. In the third boss, it was just a big moth. you didn't have to use the fire rod. The fourth boss, you couldn't use the item because it was the Titan's Mitt. The fifth boss, you could either use the Bombos Medallion or the fire rod to get him out. The sixth boss, you just kind of had to hit him. He was a big, gross eyeball. The seventh boss, this one did require, but it was the final boss before you went to Ganon's lair. It was I don't remember what it was called, but there was the fire head and the ice head. You remember Turtle Rock?
Yeah, the dragon?
Yeah.
The three-headed dragon? So you had the ice head, the fire head, and the rock head.
The turtle. And he looked like a turtle until you defeated the fire head and ice head, and then he just became a...
Right.
But you had to use magic for that one. That was one of the first ones that you had to use.
Yeah, because you had to use the opposite of the head.
And this game, I have so much fondness for it. It's a little difficult for me to objectively evaluate it because you could collect all the bottles. You could collect none of the bottles. Some people never even knew about the fairy behind the waterfall up near the Zora's domain. Some people didn't know about the little demon guy who doubled your magic capacity. There was so much stuff in that game, and so much of it was not required. It was amazing.
Yeah, there was just a lot of little side pieces. I mean, think of all the heart pieces you didn't have to get.
Yeah, it was amazing. And that freedom of exploration coupled with a nice, tight narrative, they never shoved it down your throat, but you knew what was happening.
Right.
I take that back. When you saved the Crystal Maidens, they shoved it down your throat. I take that back. For the most part, though.
But to be fair, I mean, this was the first Zelda game that they really fleshed out a cohesive story really, really well.
And the pacing did kind of get a little slow at that point only when you rescued them, because that's really where they fed you a ton of the story, was with the Crystal Maidens.
Right. Well, and you have to save all of them.
You do, because if you rescue Zelda before rescuing all the others, she'll go, thanks for rescuing me, but there's still others to go save. Because I always rescue the fifth one last, because in Super Nintendo, the Ice Palace puzzle was a huge pain if you didn't have the Cane of Samaria, which makes the blocks. You had to do this weird go back and forth, push a block into the basement.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever beat that game without rescuing all of the maidens.
Well, I rescue all the maidens, I just don't do it in order anymore.
Wow.
And order. And this game had such a degree of freedom, and it didn't shove it down your throat, that I loved it. The music was great. The visuals have held up well. The little things, like the kid in the orchard, the ghost kid, the flute boy.
Yes.
When you go to the dark world.
Oh my god, that was so, sad for its time.
It was just so sad, and then it was unsad, because he got better, which made me happy.
Well, it got better as it passed.
Well, no, in the post-credits, it says the flute boy plays again.
Does it?
Positive.
Okay.
And
I probably never paid attention to the credits long enough.
I have played that game so many times. Much like Super Mario RPG, for many years, that game was getting a yearly replay. It's so good. But I feel like we mostly just fangasmed on this particular one. But we talked about a lot of the pros and the cons. We talked about mostly pros.
Yeah, well, to be fair, this game is...
It's aged phenomenal.
It's aged well. It was a good game. At its time, even today, it's a good game. Some of the controls aren't as smooth as, modern games would be, just because of the limitations of the system.
But it's a 20-year-old game, too.
Right. But is it 20 or is it 30?
It might be closer to 30.
1991.
26.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So almost 30.
Woo. Getting up there. Almost 30. That's how you can tell. So it's just barely 25. Oh, there's some squinting going on here. But is there anything else you want to talk about Link to the Past? Because we are right at an hour.
So the only thing that I could mention was, there's the whole tie-in with the Four Swords later on, which we can touch on in the episode that we talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that then.
The other thing is there was actually a direct sequel of Link to the Past.
Oh.
That was never released here in the U.S.
Is this that download thing?
Yes, so it was a system that was called the Nintendo Satellaview, which was every week or every month or whatever, you would basically get a game downloaded to this device. You really only had room for one game.
Mm-hmm.
And this one was called Zelda no Densetsu Inishi no Sekiban, which I don't remember what that stands for. But it was basically linked to the past. I mean, it was all the same graphics and everything, but there were 4 parts to it, and you could only play it if you downloaded it at the time it was available.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was a specific time, a specific date. And if you didn't dial in and download it then, because the intro was run live.
Right.
And if you didn't see the intro, you didn't get the rest of the game.
Weird.
So if you weren't available at all 4 of the correct times, you did not get to play the full game. And you only got about, I want to say, a week to play each game to get the whole thing out of it, which was, well, this was, again, Nintendo trying to be innovative. And it's kind of like an online thing crossed with Snapchat, crossed with modems.
Well, and Sega tried something very similar. Well, theirs was actually just a dial game. That's neither here nor there. We're not going to get to it. They tried a thing, didn't work out. We never saw it, so it doesn't really affect us.
True.
I think we're good on this particular segment. What do you say, Jake?
Yeah, I think that's enough fanboying over LTTP.
Okay. And we will be back to the fanboying probably several segments from now, because Link Between Worlds will get its day in the sun, and
oh yes,
such a day.
As much as we fanboyed over Link to the Past.
Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet.
Stay tuned.
Anyways, so thank you, Jake, for coming on for the first part of what will surely be quite the segment.
Far too many?
No, not far too many. I love this series. Anyways, thank you for coming on.
You're welcome.
Until next time, this is Co-Opinions.